I watched Israel's response to South Africa. Let's get right into it.
The court meets this morning to hear the State of Israel present its single round of oral argument in the case concerning application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel. I shall now give the floor to the co-agent of Israel, Mr. Tal Becker. You have the floor, Excellency.
If there have been acts that may be characterized as genocidal, then they have been perpetrated against Israel.
There needs to be a capacity or a capability to commit a genocide. To be able to engage in the level of violence associated with genocide, perpetrators need time to develop the capacity to do so, mobilize the resources, and take concrete steps that will help them to achieve their objective. The Hamas incursion was repelled in a couple days.
When Israel withdrew all its soldiers and civilians from Gaza in 2005, it left a coastal area with the potential to become a political and economic success story.
In 2012, Amira Haas wrote for Haaretz an article confirming the existence of a so-called Red Lines document. The Red Lines document calculates the minimum number of calories needed by every age and gender group in Gaza, 2,279 calories per person per day. From this, they reduced the quantity of fruits and vegetables, milk, and meat and poultry. The idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. The quantity of fruit and vegetables Gaza could produce for itself was expected to decline from 1,000 tons a day to 500 within a few months due to the Israeli ban on bringing in seeds, as well as the ban on exporting produce.
Remarkably, counsel for the applicant described the suffering in Gaza as unparalleled and unprecedented.
The devastation and the scale of the campaign was affirmed by none other than an investigation by the Washington Post. The evidence shows that Israel has carried out its war in Gaza at a pace and level of devastation that likely exceeds any recent conflict. Aleppo, they say, is 1.5 times the size of northern Gaza. However, nearly twice as many structures were destroyed in northern Gaza in 7 weeks as were destroyed in Aleppo over 3 years. There's also Mosul, Iraq. In Iraq, as reported by the Associated Press on December 22nd, during the 2014 to 2017 campaign to defeat the Islamic State in Iraq, the U.S.-led coalition carried out nearly 15,000 strikes across the country. By comparison, the Israeli military said they conducted 22,000 strikes in the last week.
What is actually unparalleled and unprecedented is the degree to which Hamas has entrenched itself within the civilian population throughout the Strip, with thousands of access points and terrorist hubs located in homes, mosques, UN facilities, schools, and perhaps most shockingly, hospitals. Every civilian casualty in this conflict is a human tragedy.
The current Israeli war cabinet includes Gadi Eisenkot, who, in 2008, while IDF chief of Northern Command, conceived the Dahiyya Doctrine, whereby civilian areas will be disproportionately attacked by Israel in response to rocket attacks. Israel would take one important lesson away from its war with Lebanon: its complete obliteration of the Beirut suburb of Dahiyya, and a new initiative, led by former IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot, would bear its name. What happened in the Dahiyya quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. This isn't a suggestion. This is a plan that has already been authorized. Retired Major General Giora Island would invoke Dahiyya in his policy prescription for Israel in the event of another war with Lebanon. Serious damage to the Republic of Lebanon, the destruction of homes and infrastructure, and the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people are consequences that can influence Hezbollah's behavior more than anything else. According to several Israeli officials, as reported in an investigation by the Israeli 972 magazine, the bombing of power targets meaning private residences as well as public buildings, infrastructure, and high-rise blocks, which sources say the army defines as power targets, is mainly intended to harm Palestinian civil society, to create a shock that, among other things, will reverberate powerfully and lead civilians to put pressure on Hamas.
But the court is not told how many thousands of casualties are in fact militants. Israel's lawful aims in Gaza have been clearly and repeatedly articulated by its Prime Minister.
You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember and we are fighting.
Its Defense Minister.
We'll remember that it was on October 9th when Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced
no food, no water, no gas, it's all closed. We're fighting animals and are acting accordingly.
Just days later, he told troops, amid growing tensions with Lebanon, he revealed,
it is the citizens of Lebanon that will pay the price of these kinds of mistakes. What we are doing in Gaza, we can do in Beirut.
And all members of the War Cabinet. As the Prime Minister reaffirms, Israel seeks neither to permanently occupy Gaza.
With regard to bringing the population back, in the words of Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs Eli Cohen, at the end of this war, not only will Hamas no longer be in Gaza, but the territory of Gaza will also decrease.
Or to displace its civilian population.
On December 14th, the World Food Program published a food security update where they reported that more than 85% of the population of Gaza have been displaced.
And I now invite Professor Malcolm Shaw.
Hamas's explicit goal is to eradicate Jewish life from the Holy Land.
Setting aside the fact that Hamas rarely invokes the Charter, according to a 2009 report from the United States Institute of Peace, a federal institution, which read, the Charter itself contains statements that reflect a lack of hostility toward Jews on the basis of religion. For example, as Article 31 states, under Islam, the followers of the three religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, may coexist peacefully and safely. According to the RAND Corporation, the major defense think tank, Hamas dropped the language explicitly calling for Israel's destruction, which suggests an effort by Hamas to portray itself as more of an Islamic national liberation movement.
These atrocities do not justify violations of the law in reply, still less genocide. But they do justify, mandate even, the exercise of the legitimate and inherent right of a state to defend itself.
You can't invoke self-defense to justify criminal behavior per the Rome Statute. The fact that the person was involved in a defensive operation conducted by forces shall not in itself constitute a ground for excluding criminal responsibility. Further, the Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia ruled in its decision for Milan Martic that the rule which states that reprisals against the civilian population as such, or individual civilians, are prohibited in all circumstances, even when confronted by wrongful behavior of the other party, is an integral part of customary international law and must be respected in all armed conflicts. Reprisals must always be proportionate to the attacks to which they are responding and must never aim at civilians or protected objects. If these conditions are not respected, then it is an act of revenge.
That Israeli forces have transgressed some of the rules of conflict, then the matter will be tackled at the appropriate time by Israel's robust and independent legal system.
The last large-scale invasion of the Gaza Strip was in 2014, Operation Protective Edge, as it was called, which Amnesty International called deliberate destruction and targeting of civilian buildings and property on a large scale carried out without military necessity. I've never seen such massive destruction ever before, said then Red Cross Chief Peter Maurer. Yet only 4 Israeli officers were convicted of any wrongdoing. The harshest sentence was 7 months for stealing a credit card. 2 soldiers who used a 9-year-old child as a human shield received 3-month suspended sentences. No jail.
As from Israel's withdrawal of its civilian and military presence from Gaza in 2005, which brought an end to its belligerent occupation.
It's more popular to say that Gaza is somehow free from Israeli control, even though it enforces what a UN report described as a medieval military blockade, controlling imports and exports, export taxes, the territorial waters and airspace, and has blocked the building of an airport and seaport. They control electricity lines, the underwater cable that phone calls are placed on, the network that provides internet, and the frequencies assigned to Palestinian cell phone companies. There's a reason Human Rights Watch, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the United Nations, and Israel's leading expert on international law, Professor Yoram Dinstein of Tel Aviv University, have all concluded that Gaza is occupied by Israel and is therefore responsible for its population. It has failed considerably at maintaining their well-being. Michael Link, Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian Territories, reported in 2022, Gaza had undergone a multi-decade process of de-development and de-industrialization, resulting in a 45% unemployment rate and 60% poverty rate, with 80% of the population dependent on some form of international assistance. As B'Tselem concludes, Israel has continued to control nearly every aspect of life in Gaza from outside.
And I now give the floor to Ms. Galit Ragwan. You have the floor.
The application presents Israel's call to civilians to evacuate areas of intensive hostilities, quote, as an act calculated to bring about its physical destruction, quote. This is a particularly egregious allegation. Evacuation of civilians is recognized under international humanitarian law as one of the measures that may be implemented to protect civilians from the effects of ongoing hostilities. Indeed, such evacuation may even amount to a duty that the party to the conflict has towards civilians.
Israel's Energy Minister Israel Katz made it clear when he said, "All the civilian population in Gaza is ordered to leave immediately. We will win. They will not receive a drop of water or a single battery until they leave the world." Indeed, the alternative to leaving was declared in no uncertain terms by Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
Those who want to save their life, please go south.
And by IDF leaflets and cell phone audio messages. Your presence north of Wadi Gaza puts your life in danger. Whoever chooses not to leave North Gaza to the south of Wadi Gaza might be identified as an accomplice in a terrorist organization. And the destruction of homes and property ensured that there's nowhere for them to go back to. In the trial judgment for Mladen Nedeljković and Vinko Martinović, the Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia interpreted that the deliberate destruction of homes was indicative of intent to forcibly displace civilians. When a genuine evacuation takes place, there is an obligation to bring the population back when the hostilities have ended. No attempts to return them were made. In fact, most of their houses were torched.
The IDF maintains a civilian harm mitigation unit. It works full-time to provide advance notice of areas in which the IDF intends to intensify its activities.
Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant ordered over 1 million residents in Gaza's north to relocate south. Gaza's north contains all of Gaza City and the largest hospital in all of the Gaza Strip, Al-Shifa. The New York Times also reports that while fleeing, an Israeli airstrike struck a convoy of vehicles trying to flee the north along a main highway. Despite the evacuation order to separate Hamas from the civilian population, Israel is still bombing the south, which is crammed with hundreds of thousands of fleeing refugees. And as I reported days ago, last Tuesday, the IDF spokesperson said the emphasis is on damage rather than on precision.
Israel has publicly stated repeatedly that there is no limit on the amount of food, water, shelter, or medical supplies that can be brought into Gaza.
I wanted to begin with a new report from Human Rights Watch. The Israeli government is using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare in the Gaza Strip, which is a war crime. Israeli forces are deliberately blocking the delivery of water, food, and fuel. They remind us that this was not an unfortunate, unintended consequence of war, but a plan which was openly stated ad nauseum by Israeli officials. The Israeli energy minister, the one who oversees the supply of energy into Gaza, stated on October 16th, "I strongly oppose the opening of the blockade and the introduction of goods into Gaza on humanitarian grounds." According to Human Rights Watch, the Israeli army has also been employing bulldozers, in an example that can hardly be called unintentional. Since the beginning of the Israeli military's ground offensive on October 27th, satellite imagery reviewed by Human Rights Watch indicates that orchards, greenhouses, and farmland in northern Gaza have been razed. The razing of agricultural land continued in northern Gaza during the 7-day ceasefire, which began on November 24th and ended on December 1st, when the Israeli military was in direct control of the area. Farmers in this area planted crops such as citrus fruit, potatoes, dragon fruit, and prickly pear, contributing to the livelihoods of Palestinians in Gaza. Other crops include tomatoes, cabbage, and strawberries. Some plots were raised in a day. Trees that yield citrus fruit, as well as the cacti that yield dragon fruit, take years of care to mature before they can yield fruit. High-resolution satellite imagery shows bulldozers were used to destroy fields and orchards. tracks are visible, as well as mounds of earth on the edges of the former plots. Euromed Monitor gives us further understanding of the sheer desperation of the situation in a recent report on starvation. Comprising a sample of 1,200 people in Gaza, Euromed Monitor concluded that more than 71% of participants reported that they suffer from extreme hunger. 98% say they eat insufficient amounts of food, and 64% admitted they had eaten grass, immature, and expired food.
And I invite Mr. Omri Sender to address the court. You have the floor.
Access to water has also been a priority.
According to OCHA, or the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, on November 4th and 5th, 7 water facilities across the Gaza Strip were directly hit and sustained major damage, including 3 sewage pipelines in Gaza City, 2 water reservoirs in Gaza City, Rafah, and Jabalia refugee camp, and 2 water wells in Rafah. The Gaza municipality warned about the imminent risk of sewage flooding. Indeed, the targeting of water infrastructure prompted Euromed to describe Israel's campaign as a war of starvation. The Israeli war of starvation has taken very dangerous turns, including cutting off all food supplies to the northern half and bombing and destroying factories, bakeries, food stores, water stations, and tanks throughout the entire enclave. Prior to the ongoing Israeli war, 70% of the Gaza Strip's children suffered from varying health issues, including malnutrition, anemia, and weakened immunity. However, Euromed Monitor said the number has increased to over 90% as a result of the unprecedented Israeli attacks.
COGAT, the unit in the Ministry of Defense in charge of monitoring the humanitarian situation.
COGAT, or the Office of Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, is the unit in the Ministry of Defense in charge of monitoring the humanitarian situation in Gaza. In his words, here's COGAT's director, Ghassan Alian, head of the Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, explained,
سكان غزة بدل ما يصدمهم الاشي عم بيحتفلوا مع هيك وحوش بشرية رايحين نتعامل كيف لازم مش راح يكون في عندكم كهرباء ولا مي بس دمار بدكم جهنم راح تحصلوا على جهنم.
And I now invite Mr. Christopher Staker to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.
I next address the 5th requested measure. This specifies types of acts to be regarded as deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. It seeks further impermissible implied rulings on the merits. For instance, it refers to so-called expulsion and forced displacement of Palestinians from their homes. This is an apparent reference to Israel's practice of issuing calls for civilians to temporarily evacuate areas of intense hostilities, which is in fact a measure to mitigate harm to civilians. This measure thus seeks the court's ruling that evacuation calls amount to expulsion and forced displacement of Palestinians from their homes.
Just one small problem, as described by the Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia in the appeal judgment for Milomir Stakic. Although displacement for humanitarian reasons is justifiable in certain situations, the appeals chamber agrees with the prosecution that it is not justifiable where the humanitarian crisis that caused the displacement is itself the result of the accused's own unlawful activity. With regard to Bosnian Muslims, the displacement was involuntary, and that, to the extent it had a humanitarian purpose, this was only because of a humanitarian crisis that the appellant himself had deliberately caused.
As the authority responsible for international law advice to Israel's government and cabinet, I can attest that in contending with these challenges, Israel remains committed to international law.